Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Today, we are starting the first of a two-part series focused on yield monitor data and all the components that go along with that. So harvest is going to be here before we know it. And of course, Elizabeth, you have a strong background in this. We've also brought on Dr. John Fulton. He's been on before, but John, would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda and Elizabeth, for having me. John Fulton, and I'm a extension specialist in the Food, Ag, and Biological Engineering Department here at Ohio State.
As you may know, that yield data that we're using is a calculated estimate based off of a variety of sensors that are on your combine, and making sure that those sensors are set up to get that estimate accurate or as close as we can to the true value in the field is incredibly important. So John, could you kick us off with an overview of the sensors that go into creating that data?
Yeah, so I guess I would kind of say first, the value of yield data today is just immense. I mean, we're using it and pretty much all the precision ag services that I can think about that are offered to farmers today. Yield monitoring data is such a critical layer. And when we think about what that's informing, not just for the farmers, but even for consultants supporting those farmers, it becomes very imperative to focus that, we want quality data coming off. And I think the important aspect that we want to emphasize is it's one thing on a combine to harvest a field and say, we get 24,000 pounds or whatever that is off the field. Obviously, that's an important figure to understand what we're delivering back to the bins or the elevator. But what we're really getting down to is the map. We want data that is representative of the spatial variability of yield out there, and keeping an eye on that becomes very important. Obviously, yield monitor data can be used for a variety of things, but today, not only is it telling us where high and low yields are, but we're using it to inform nutrient management plans, what we put back on the field in terms of primarily P and K and micros and sometimes, but it's informing seeding maps today, both corn and soybeans to some, depending on how people are creating zones and assigning values to them, but it's also beginning to look at profitability, grain marketing, and we're starting to look, in some cases, services that look at that on a field by field, if not subfield, and it's becoming very important, right? We're in a time here, not only in 2025, but in the coming years, it's going to be pretty tight margins, and as we evaluate the farm operation and make decisions on inputs, and practices that we're bringing back onto certain fields, the yield monitor data becomes such a critical layer in informing all that. But it's not just that overall value, it's the spatial representation of that yield in that map that becomes important, because we don't want to be making decisions where we think we should be investing more or less and find out that that's not really the case because we didn't take some time and set that yield monitor, calibrate it, and operate that combine in a way to capture that true relative variability to make these decisions on. It becomes very important. So when we think about the combine itself, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, we're talking about using different sensors. Okay, and so obviously ground speed is important. That typically today comes from the GNSS receiver, and that's fairly accurate. The other sensors that are being used, obviously majority of the yield monitors use a mass flow sensor. Most of those if you crawled up in a clean grain elevator and looked at the top of that, you would see a plate with a sensor. Now we do have some optical ones that are operated on like the Challenger combines or the Kloss combines. They use optical that are located down on a clean grain elevator. But the mass flow sensor, I would say, covers 80% of the combines are in Ohio being used. So that becomes our primary focus, is how do we make sure that mass flow sensor is mounted and managed and calibrated. And then we look at moisture grain moisture. We got to have that in order to not only have the wet weight, obviously that we can get off the field, but to be able to bring that back to an elevator, a marketable measurement as well. Whether that's 15% for corn, 13 for soybeans and wheat, but we want to be able to know what our marketable yield is as well, not just our wet weight. So that's coming out, that's being adjusted, or that grain moisture sensor is providing that so we can adjust back to that marketable yield. And then we're also going to look at things like the elevated grain, the speed of that clean grain elevators. Obviously, the manufacturer should have a pretty high-end encoder or similar telling us what the speed of that is. And then we also want to be able to adjust when are we harvesting and when we don't harvest. And that sensor usually is embedded in the feeder housing or up on the header. If we're up, at the end and turning, it shuts logging off. Once the header goes back down and we're engaged in a crop, it tells us, hey, we need to start logging data. And so we don't want to capture, data on the end and say we got zero yield, and so we don't want to log that data when we're making turns or traversing across the field to go somewhere else or something like that. So those are some of the main things. So the mass flow sensor, the moisture sensor, and then the on and off logging that goes on at the front of the combine if our header's up or down.
Well, there's certainly several components that go into this, and you mentioned this being an estimate, and part of that is making sure all of these components are working effectively. So what should farmers be thinking about as they're getting ready to calibrate in all those different pieces, and how often should they be looking at each of those throughout the harvest season?
So a lot of those components most definitely should be looked at the beginning of the season before you start. The things that can affect, especially that impact sensor reading, is going to be the wear and tear on things like the paddle in your clean grain elevator, making sure that you're replacing those so that they're in good shape, and then calibrating anytime in the season you have to do any kind of parts replacement is going to be important. Throughout the season, we know usually we start with high moistures at the beginning of the season, and things in most years tend to dry out. Making sure that your moisture sensor is staying within range and being aware if you have a big swing in moisture and temperature that can affect the accuracy as well.
Preseason maintenance, which hopefully everyone's getting ready for right now, is making sure they're clean. There's no dirt or debris. One thing, as Elizabeth mentioned, is making sure nothing's wore out. But making sure your grain moisture sensor, the what we call the plates or the sensor itself, pull it off, make sure it's clean, nothing seems damaged, things like that. And on the mass flow sensor on the plate, that it's not worn, as Elizabeth mentioned, or it doesn't have buildup. One of the things that we see sometimes, especially, is that, last year in some cases we may have had some green stem soybeans, and sometimes that's having that green stem, you got moisture and you got dust. It ends up building up not only on the front, but on the back side of that mass flow sensor. And obviously that changes the mass and can really impact the measurements it's making on it. So those are two things that just pull them off, or at least give a visual and on them and make sure they're clean. So
I'd say perhaps for 2025, something that normally we get away with overlooking, but this year might be something to pay attention to, is we've got a lot of corn with the growing season that we had that got taller than normal. Mm-hmm. So John talked about making sure that your height sensor is adjusted for on off. If you're running your combine with that header higher than you normally do, because those ears, I've been in fields where the ears are above my head. If you're trying to manage the amount of residue going through your machine by raising your header, double check that you've reset that height sensor. Otherwise, you might have a tragic mistake where you get to the end of the field and realize you logged no data, perhaps.
Yeah, or log data. And again, I just emphasize, at some point, if you got a bunch of zeros at the end of and no one cleans that at the end of the, once the map's generated, then you're going to have a lot of zero values that gets averaged in, and that's just not reflective of the yield in those areas.
Yeah, I get a little narrowly focused on this working with farmers and on-farm research and wanting them to have proper calibration. So we have good data coming out of that research project. But as you both have mentioned, and I just can't reiterate it enough, that there are so many decisions made off of this yield data today that having it properly calibrated and recalibrating, we can talk about how often they should be doing that a little bit more if you want to, throughout the season, just making sure and helping farmers understand, the amount of importance they're putting on this data with each decision that they make based on it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we think about, I know one of the excuses for not calibrating and not spending the time is the time commitment to making sure that everything is working the way it should be. It's hard to see issues in that yield data due to a calibration issue. But if you really reflect on the amount of money that you're spending in inputs based on this information, it can be a sobering moment. I think if you look across the state, we're talking millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars that are being spent on decisions based on this information.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, thinking ahead to this harvest, one thing that I've seen in some fields is the amount of variability that we're going to see in yield. And so if you remember here a month and a half ago, we had some pretty significant storm in some areas that came and laid some corn and even beans down, but corn in particular, and we had green snap. And so, whether it was water laying early, after planting, and we're going to have some low yield, but there's some fields that not only have spots that have no yield, but there's spots that I'd be surprised if they don't run up into the 250, 300 bushel. I mean, it's looking really good. My point in all that is we're going to have a lot of fields that are going to have a high range of yield. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to reemphasize that if we don't calibrate, you hear this comment a lot, well, what I get off my ticketed elevator matches what the yield monitor said I took off for that field. Yes, okay, that's true. And that's within 1-2%. So you can't use that and say my calibration is dead on. What we're talking about is when we move through the field and we're collecting data every 1 second or every 2 seconds, how accurate is one yield data from the next yield data? And so your overall accumulated weight for that field may be within 1 or 2% of the scaled tickets that you took off from the trucks and wagons. But that doesn't say that that's in each one of those yield data is relatively, because I could be off 10% over here and negative 10% over here, and that averages out to zero error. And so, overall, we do a pretty good job of loading trucks and accumulated mass, even on uncalibrated in a lot of cases. But we're talking about having a map that says over here, relatively speaking, this area was, 40 bushels less or 10 bushels less, or this area over here, we were 50 bushel better. We want those numbers to be correct and not have errors where they're inflated or, underestimated. We're trying to get those numbers, and that's what we're talking about, this calibration. So just because your scaled tickets are matching what the yield monitor says accumulated, we're taking off the field pretty close, doesn't mean that it's calibrated to say spatially that it's relatively accurate.
Yeah, that's key when I think about some farm management decisions that are being made, especially as we get into tighter profit margins. Farmers might be thinking about taking certain areas out of production and maybe putting into a conservation reserve program or something like that. And you really want to have that accurate yield data to know down to the acre, what did that acre produce? Is that positive or negative in my bottom line? And if you're off, just a little bit, then that can really impact. You might be taking productive acres out or leaving unproductive acres in and defeating the whole point of that decision-making strategy.
Or you're taking that map and converting it to a removal map.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And if it spatially doesn't represent, there could be cases where I'm not going to fertilize, where if I'm off, we've seen in some of our data, if it's not calibrated appropriately, and whether it's a high yield or low yielding area in particular is where we run into bigger issues. and we talk a little bit more about that. But you may be fertilizing or not fertilizing areas based on that yield map that's 30 or 40% off. And I'm making that decision on my input decision today. That's a tough one for me to chew on in this tight margin, where we're at with margins today.
Yeah, I think when we talk about calibration, there's also this common misconception that you can take your total weight at the end of the season and shift that yield map up or down. And I think the issue that we see with that is that yield response from that calculation with your calibration isn't necessarily linear. In fact, it's most likely not. So if you don't have a representative calibration curve, you could be biased on one end or the other of that curve and overestimating or underestimating high or low yield areas, which are those, I think, critical areas when you're making decisions, such as fertilizing or not. So do we want to talk in detail about, obviously your calibration recommendation is going to be specific to the yield monitor that you're equipped with, but there are some generalities that we can discuss. So John, do you want to go into just a general overview of what a common calibration approach should look like? So
I think first of all, for everyone, we can do a pretty good job of fine-tuning a moisture sensor. And the reason behind that is that's a linear sensor. Okay, and we've got data that we could show people about that. So all I'm doing is shifting the line up or down. So if I'm off 2 points, high or low, I can adjust that line and be right on. And so, taking the time to get that fine-tuned is not, there's some time involved in that, but you can get that pretty well locked in terms of the grain moisture sensor. The biggest issue we run into is as you alluded to, is the mass flow sensors, regardless of company, regardless of who it is a nonlinear response. So as you think about, depressing that, okay, keeping it simple, depressing it just doesn't linearly go up. It's kind of asymptotic. It's a curve. And so as you look around, regardless of company that uses a mass flow sensor for the most part, we want to do what is described as a multi-point calibration. And I'll tell everyone right now, I would recommend doing at least 5 loads, okay, 5 different loads to calibrate that sensor, that mass flow sensor. And the reason we do that is to try and map out the response of that mass flow sensor. This response of that is influenced not only by the combine, but by the driver or operator as well, how they operate that combine. Okay, in terms of how fast they go, how they kind of manage the ground speed, are you in auto or not? And so when we talk about those loads, the 4 loads that you have to run, which are basic, is you run a low flow rate, kind of a moderate flow rate, a little bit above average flow rate, and then a high flow rate. And the way we do that is 2 ways. We either run at different speeds, like 2, 3, 4, and 5 miles an hour, to get different flow rates through the combine, relatively speaking, to get that. So understanding that if I'm running 2, 3 miles an hour, that's pretty slow to accumulate like 8,000 pounds, okay? But the point is, we're trying to map out that response curve for that combine in sensor combination, okay, within that crop. And so if we do that appropriately, making sure that we get down on the lower end of what we expect the mass flow rate and the high end plus the 2 in between, we're going to do a good job of mapping out that nonlinear curve. And so as you go through the field and yield changes in particular, we're on that curve and we can do a good estimating of what the mass flow rate is, and then we can calculate the yield based on the mass flow rate, what the grain moisture was at that location, okay, ground speed and everything in the area that we get a pretty good estimate. And I would tell all the listeners, if you take the time to do that multi-point, especially 4 different loads, you can get yourself within 2%. That would be my suggestion. You can work yourself and get pretty confident that you can be 2%, excuse me. It could be 3, there's some other things, but 2 to 3% is achievable. The fifth load that I always talk about is, okay, then go back and do a fifth load after you do all 4 of those at different things, is run at a nominal speed that you're expected, and go back and say, well, this is, pick a swath that maybe even have some variability in it. Run a fifth load at kind of your nominal operating conditions, how you're going to operate the combine, and see what it gives you. Do that, and it should be, if it's done right, you should be back to that 2 to 3% on that fifth load. And if you are, you got it mapped out and you're dialed in and ready to go. So it's just important to do that. If we're using maps to inform decisions, you've got to go through that process. Now, I mentioned that you can use speed. The other way you can do it is you can take portions of the header. So I can take a full header, I can take 3/4 of a header, I can take a half header and a quarter header, and do the same thing in terms of adjusting the flow rate. So if I wanted to run 5 miles an hour, but I'm taking, a portion of the header, I'm getting down to that lower flow rate to map that out. So either adjust speed or you adjust how much you're taking with your header when you do that calibration. But my recommendation is at least do 5 loads minimum. And if it's done right, that fifth load's a check, and you should be within 2 to 3%.
Yeah. And I think just to remind, if you're watching your monitor as you're doing these loads, you're going to see the bushels per acre number, and it's probably going to look similar across all of these loads. But what you're really trying to manipulate and get a representative sample of is that flow rate. So you're going to see the corrected bushel per acre value because the area is going to be different, either based off of header width or by speed, but you are mimicking that slower or faster flow rate that's going to, when you are going that normal speed and you're harvesting and yield is lower or higher, it's going to mimic that flow rate. So not fully intuitive when you're looking at your monitor and seeing the bushels per acre stay the same, but you're manipulating that flow rate value, which is that key piece that sensor is estimating that goes into that calculation. Do we want to talk a little bit about some of the newer yield monitoring technologies and how those fit into our traditional calibration discussion?
So I would say, in my mind, there's 3 in particular new technologies that have tried to help improve collecting quality yield data. And the first one probably is, most people would know if you run a new S series or an X combine from John Deere, would be the auto yield feature, which basically they've built some sensors into we'll keep it simple here, into the clean grain or the tank that helps adjust that calibration curve on the go. So if you're a grower that never calibrates, this is something that helps provide a calibration curve for your particular mass flow sensor and makes adjustment based on the conditions and things that you're operating under. And so Deere, I believe, has trademarked the name, I think, Auto Yield. There's some other companies out there that have kind of taken on something similar, but primarily you see Deere combines running this type feature that basically you can think of it calibrating on the go. And so as an operator, I don't have to really maybe feel like I have to take the time and do the calibration we just talked about. I would still recommend doing some calibration loads under different flow rates in a manual mode just to make sure, because there's still conditions and characteristics of the crop that can influence that mass flow estimate. And so while the auto yield feature is nice and helps adjust for changes in crop conditions as you move through harvest, checking that if you're going to is a good beneficial step. It still would be encouraged on my part to do that. The second one that I think most yield monitoring manufacturers or people selling combines with yield monitors on is the auto area, and there's some different names out there, but it's basically using your GPS, the center line of the combine, knowing how big your header is, and then looking at prior passes and saying, well, let's just pretend we got a platform header 40 foot. I'm really taking 38 foot, so I've got 2 foot that I'm not taking, and so it auto adjusts the width to help make sure that the area calculation for that yield is correct. And so I might be taking 39 foot, I might be taking 38, maybe down to 37, but using the GNSS receiver and the center line, it basically estimates what's the cut width of that particular header or that during that pass. And so that automatically, again, makes an auto adjustment to the cut width that goes into calculating the area of each individual point that's being collected as that we're going to estimate yield. Now the third thing is very similar, but we see, or I've seen more in Europe than I have here, is there's companies that are putting sensors out on the header themselves and measuring the cut width. And so, and in particular on platform headers, they're sensors, and they can not only look ahead, but they're looking at what the actual cut width. So they may be using the GNSS receiver, as I explained, as a secondary input, but they're actually looking at the header full time and saying, hey, you're taking, especially if I'm operating point rows, you're not at 8 rows, you're down to 6 rows. Now you're down to 5, down to 4. Yep, I got a platform, back to my 40-foot platform. You're really only taking 37.5 foot. So it's constantly looking at the header and saying exactly what the width of that cut is. And that, like I said, is probably more in Europe than I saw then than I've seen here in the U.S. And so those are the three, in my mind, technologies that are available or have been being used to help or try and improve some of the yield estimates.
Yeah, I think the auto swath detection is pretty handy until it's not working. I know we ran into a couple of scenarios last year with the solar flare storms that we were having, interfering with that GNSS fix, and seeing some yield maps where it was getting a little bit wonky on that swath width, leading to an inaccurate yield estimate. So that's one of those things, if you start seeing straight lines that look wonky, that's a diagnostic space to look. It's an easy correction if your memory serves you well and you knew you were running a full swath width, but it suddenly said half because it shifted your combine over on that imaginary surface that it's drawing on the map. Easy to fix, but sometimes difficult to catch.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just kind of mentioned that telematics and wireless capabilities are also playing a role in this, because I just want to kind of emphasize, not only for farmers, but consultants providing services. We've got data now rolling off these combines right into these cloud platforms. That's really helped us collect data. But again, that may not reflect anything about the quality of the data that's coming off of the combine. And so some of that still rests within the operator's seat to make sure that that's happening in terms of these sensors being calibrated. But, if we're not paying attention to this, but we're using the data to inform some of the decisions that I think we're going to talk about in our next series, it can be a big impact. And like I said, we just got done with a research project. I think we'll kind of dive in next time on a little bit about the spatial accuracy and what we can really kind of glean from maps out of this, or at least identify the resolution in which we can use these maps. But it's easy to be 23 to 30% off if you're not appropriately calibrating that mass flow sensor.
I think this was really helpful as farmers get started into the fields. I am really looking forward to part 2 and really diving into how we can use that data. How do I want to say that? Accurately, maybe, and effectively. John, as you just mentioned, and I think that's important for our listeners to know too, as they start to see maybe some research results or publications come out, and they're using yield data to make sure that they appropriately use that yield data. Okay, you do have some resources on calibration, right?
Absolutely.
So we can link those into the description, and they're by manufacturer. So you need more details on accurately calibrating. FABE has you covered there. So.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. Until next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.